This is part 5, I think, of the MIP 410 Legend project. And as you can see, the electronics are all installed. I have a nice, beautiful pink wing installed, and the wheels and tires are installed, and it's basically done. I just have to paint the body, put the decals on, and then it's all set to go. So I'll go over the electronics a bit. So you may notice here that I'm using a saddle pack configuration, and this is a custom configuration, and the reason for that fundamentally goes back to the belt. So I had mentioned before that the belt that I had used here, it has to be longer because I'm using the world's front end, which lengthens the wheelbase, but the particular belt that I used was maybe a little bit too long, and so to pick up the slack I had to put this tensioner in here. Now I could go back and try to find a belt with maybe 2 or 3 fewer teeth so that I can maybe not have to use this tensioner and allow me to lift the bottom part of this belt up a bit, which would allow me to fit the servo to mount it where it's normally supposed to go, and then I can mount the stick pack and everything would be all hunky-dory. But what's the fun in that, right? So what I figured I would do is try to figure out a way to lay out the electronics with this particular belt, and what that basically meant is that I had to mount the servo back here. And if I mount the servo back here, it does not leave quite enough space to run a shorty pack anywhere around here. So the only logical solution was to run a saddle pack and then mount the speed control and the receiver in line in the middle. And it just barely fits. So in order to do this saddle pack configuration, what I did is I picked up a set of B44.1 lipo braces. They're just these sort of U-shaped braces, and one for each side. I sized them out and I drilled holes through the bottom of the chassis and countersunk them so that I can screw them in place. I did sort of not do a completely perfect job. I scratched up the chassis just a tad while I was countersinking the holes because I don't have exactly the right bits to do that. But I got it done, and basically this is like a B44 saddle setup in terms of the carbon fiber pieces that are used. Some really nice J-Concepts thumb screws here, blue aluminum thumb screws. It goes nice with the J-Concepts steering rack and the J-Concepts wing nuts. For the receiver, I found a Novak Mercury receiver, which I think it's maybe a little bit ahead of its time in terms of the vintage of this 410 Legend, but I thought it would be nice because it's a very sort of bling receiver, and back in the day when we were running AM and FM and PCM receivers, interference was a problem, or at least it was something you really had to worry about. So what Tiken and Novak eventually did was come out with these metal plated receivers, which were basically shielded. The metal plating creates a Faraday shield around the receiver and protects the receiver from most or all interference. So these were pretty popular back in the day. For the speed control, I have a Novak 410 HPC. This came out, I think, around 1992 or 93. For its time, it was the best speed control of its day, and it's pretty rare today. So I actually have I have one in very good condition. I decided to use it for this. I figured it would be appropriate. It's one of my favorite DC speed controls, so it goes well with this chassis. For the servo, I went overboard, especially considering that I'm not running this. But this is a vintage Airtronics 94358 servo. I think it's like a 0.1 second transit time and about 200 ounces of torque. It's way overkill for this car, but I thought, again, it's a really nice brand new vintage servo. It would go great with this car, so that goes nicely. The antenna mount I put over here because there's really with the way the batteries mount, there are no other countersunk holes that I could use without drilling another one that I could use for this antenna mount. So I just put it over here and ran the antenna up. You can probably see here, let's get some better lighting, that the ball cup that goes into the bell crank here runs really close against this nut that tightens against the bearings for this tensioner setup. In fact, for a very small part of the steering throw, it does actually slightly rub against there. So this is a really, really tight setup. If I ran like the standard associated white ball cups, I would have enough clearance to get around this, but I want to keep everything yellow, and again, I'm never going to run this, so it's really good for display purposes to keep the yellow one in there. So that goes there. Let's see, for the motor, I decided to use an Orion Revolution 12-turn double DC motor. I thought this would be appropriate for this chassis. So what was special about the Orion Revolution motors is the way in which the brushes were mounted. Back when we used to run brushed motors, you could run either what was called a stand-up brush layout or a lay-down brushed layout. And it just had to do with literally whether the brushes stood up against the commutator like this or laid down like this. And if they stood up, you could generally get higher RPM, and if they laid down, you could generally get better torque and a wider torque band over the RPM range. But with this motor, the end bell was such that the brushes were angled into the commutator. And with this kind of angled setup, when the brushes touch the commutator, they actually touch with the highest surface area, higher than either stand-up or lay-down brush assembly. So these motors were very fast for their time. I never actually had the luxury of running one when we were running brushed motors, but I hear they were very, very nice. So I put one of those in there. The wiring is pretty tight because the speed control fits in pretty tight as it is, and I wanted to run the wires under the belt to get to this part of the LiPo here. Because if I ran the wires over the belt and then I mount the body, it might press the wires down onto the belt. So I just want to make sure I have, good wire clearance from the belt here. So that pretty much covers the electronics. The wing here, I got really lucky on eBay the other day, and I found a brand new in package pink associated wing. These are the same exact wings that you would get for the Yokomo YC10. Associated had imported those back in the late 80s, early 90s, and all they really did was just put them in a bag and put their name on the package, but it's the same exact wing. So I thought with the pink wheels, pink wing would go very nicely, and since it's extra rare, it would be appropriate for this kind of rare, one-of-a-kind setup here. So that's the pink wing. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I mean, if I look back at the build, I'd say it wasn't exactly perfect. My biggest gripe is probably sort of this little nut here for that tightens in to hold these bearings in for the tensioner. It only just barely threads onto the screw here, and if I made the screw any longer to get more threading, it would run up against this ball cup. So that's the tightest margin that you have there. If this belt crank maybe went out, if this arm went out a little further on the belt crank, then I'd have enough space to run a longer screw and tighten this down properly. But with the way these belt cranks this particular belt crank arm is currently set up, I can't do that. So that's just something I have to live with. And really, this is just a proof of concept to show that, you can do the belt drive conversion with the longer front end. It just takes a little bit of creativity and a lot of elbow grease. So I hope you enjoyed this video series. I really enjoyed this project. This is probably one of my favorite projects that I've done so far. And yeah, I think that's it for now. So maybe when I have painted the body, I'll make another video, but that's doubtful just for a painted body. You've probably seen me on Facebook on occasion, so I'll be posting pictures of this on Facebook, especially after the body is painted. And yeah, I think that's it for this MIP 410 Legend project here. So thanks for watching.